Police officers have Reddit. What absurd situation have you just happened upon and realized no one called the cops? I was off duty playing poker with some neighbors and friends. One of the guys at the table is a hard Vietnam vet. In the middle of a hand, he downs his glass of scotch, hits himself in the chest, and lights a cigarette. He stands up and says, "Well, I'm having a heart attack." He then walks out and drives to the hospital. Everyone thought he was joking. Sure enough, he had, and survived, a heart attack. Story 2. I do mountain bike patrol in a smallish/medium-sized city. Was just riding one morning just after rush hour and spotted a little kid, probably 3 to 4 years old, standing on the side of the road with no parents in sight. Stopped and asked him where his parents were, and he just kinda shrugged. Called it in, and some dude ran out of some townhomes across the street and said the little dude was standing out there for a few hours, and he was watching him to keep an eye on him. There were people around and everything, but we never got a call for it. Long story short, he wandered out of the room him and his mom were staying in nearby and wandered out to the street. Place was a shelter for a woman, and he was able to get out past the manager and a court police officer. Mom had died from an overdose 3 days prior, and when the little guy got hungry, he got out of the room and wandered out to the street. No one even went to check on her either, despite the smell. Edit. Because some people asked, I'll clarify this shelter was not a homeless shelter. It was a shelter designed to house abused women and children temporarily that had nowhere else to go. Mostly, it was designed to help bring them into the system by giving them a place to stay until their social workers and caseworkers can get them better accommodations. Kind of like a more secure hotel. The women were free to leave and do their own thing, and there wasn't a full-service staff like in a homeless shelter or a rehabilitation facility. Edit 2. Thanks to the kind of Redditor who gilded me, but please help out someone else with your money. It's starting to get hot out, so go buy your local homeless dude some bottled water or donate to charity. Finally, please go out and push your legislators and the people in power to fix our healthcare and rehabilitation system. Many millions of people suffer from our lack of ability to help those in need, especially the mentally ill and the neglected members of our society. Push for the end on the war on drugs to stop the cycle. Well, that's kind of sad. I mean, the hotel-ish kind of area they got sounds nice and all, but, this kid was in a room for how long with his mom that had passed? I just, for all the edits we're getting, I need to know if this kid's okay in reality. Story 3. I'm really late to the party here, but 3 weeks later after I started, I was on my way to our off-site property control, just driving through a residential area to avoid the congestion, and take a look at my new beat. I drive past a house with smoke pouring out from the eaves and 2 guys watching across the street. They pointed at it as I stopped and said, "I think there's a fire." Think was an understatement. This entire house was filled with smoke, windows were black with soot, and still no call. These 2 guys were just chatting away and not doing anything. I couldn't see fire, but it was July 10th and a sunny morning. No mistaking a house fire in broad daylight. So I call it in and try to gain access and yell for any survivors. Keep in mind, I have 0 fire training, but have half a brain enough to know that if there are any survivors in there, I won't be any help to them and will just be another body to yard out once the fire does arrive. I get into the backyard by jumping over the hood of a minivan and sliding across like a Duke brother because there is so much junk everywhere. This takes a piece of the wooden fence and jams my radio key button open so everyone can hear me breathing, yelling for survivors, etc. I have no idea I've got an open mic at this time. I lay down on the deck and look through the sliding glass door, and there's only about 4 inches up from the floor I can see. I continue to yell for survivors, but get no response. As soon as fire gets there, they make a slow entry because the front door has been barricaded. This is when I knew something wasn't right. Suspicions were confirmed when firefighters yarded out 4 children, a mother, and father. The father was the last one taken out and the only survivor. Everyone else, except an infant, had been slaughtered with a kitchen knife. Doing CPR on a child that you can see is obviously gone is something that will haunt me forever. I never thought I could take someone's life until I had to try and help a child that was killed by his father. I never wanted to choke the life out of someone more. Talking about it helps, but it still hurts. I was hoping the story was going to take a funny turn when he said his radio button was open and everyone could hear him breathing heavily, but this is sad and brutal and scary, and, I hope he's getting some sort of counseling or therapy because that has got to be just horrific. Story 4. Not in LE anymore, but was for about 12 years in a large city. When I was a patrolman, I got a call about someone shooting off fireworks in a strip mall at 2 a.m. These were common calls, so we would usually just go check the area and clear the call. I checked the parking lot and didn't find anything, but noticed the lights were on at one of the strip mall businesses. I won't say what business it was, but it was owned by a pretty prominent local businessman. Anyway, I got out to check and found the front door unlocked, which was suspicious. We had a lot of burglaries in the area, so I asked dispatch to call a rep for the business. I was clearing the building and found the owner and several other people all really prominent, in a back room where a poker table was set up. One of the guys was sitting down and had a pile of coats in his lap, which was really weird, and he was acting like he was in pain. I saw blood droplets under his chair and asked him what was wrong. He broke down and moved the coats, then revealed he had a gunshot wound in his thigh. Long story short, these guys had a high-stakes poker game every week and someone tried to rob it and things went sideways. The dude robbing it shot this guy in the leg, which some citizen heard and called in a fireworks call. The guys involved in the game weren't going to call the cops and were arranging to have a doctor come treat him off the books. Gambling is illegal in the state I worked in, but we honestly wouldn't have given a crap. We actually caught the guy that did it, but the DA wouldn't prosecute because the victims/witnesses didn't want to testify or be involved. The victim recovered fine. One of the guys who I interviewed told me that they were robbed of over $30,000. For $30,000, I'd be testifying. But you never know what's going on in the back rooms of places like these, whatever place it is. Man, I wish we had more info. Story 5. So many. There's the usual drive-by shootings, gang violence, etc., to the infuriating child abuse/child exploitation matters. Though to be completely honest, the most absurd situation in which no one called the police was when my crazy neighbors across the street had their father-in-law have a heart attack on their front lawn during a barbecue. The guy's son was having the mother of all tantrums, shoving people, screaming, rolling on the ground, pulling up grass, literally broke a window, all while shrieking at the top of his voice, "Please God, don't take my dad!" The other relatives allowed this spectacle to unfold before their eyes while they formed a semicircle around this dude's seemingly lifeless corpse. I finally looked out my window, opened it, and shouted if anyone had called 911. Got around 20 blank stares. I called for them and the crazy son tried to attack the paramedics while they were loading his dad into the ambulance. Called the cops for them too. Common sense really isn't all that common. First off, I'm glad that the dad is doing well, or at least I hope so. It says they loaded him into the ambulance and, I just pray he's doing all right. And two, it sounds like everybody, and the son especially, do not do well under pressure at all. Rolling on the ground, pulling up the lawn, and then he broke his own window? And nobody called police? For as much acting out that is, I gotta wonder what was in the barbecue. Story 6. Former LEO. Worked a late shift and was driving home and decided to stop for some breakfast at Waffle House. I noticed a few people flagging me down as I pulled into the parking lot, which was shared by an auto repair shop. They point me to the back, so I pull over and turn my spotlight on. On the back side of the repair shop, there was a dumpster, and there was a man laying down beside it behind the fence. I could see his feet. Then another homeless man walked out with a bowl and literally walked right by my car toward Waffle House. He was soaked, by the way. So I walk over to the man laying down and he's unresponsive. I call in and EMTs arrive and the guy is dead. I still to this day have no idea how or why. I have the homeless guy waiting for me next to the Waffle House and I ask him what happened. And he said he was out cold. I was pouring water on him to keep him warm. Video from the auto shop shows guy walking and collapses next to the dumpster. He wasn't shot or anything, so who knows? Heart attack, stroke or something? And for 45 minutes, this homeless man walked over to the water hose beside the Waffle House, filled a bowl up and poured water on him because it was slightly cool outside and he didn't want him to get too cold. Water was cold faucet water, by the way. Literally nothing ever came close to the weirdness of that night in my entire career. Story 7. My father was a village policeman in the UK during the 80s, so this is his story. Lady bought a house and after so many days and weeks getting settled in, she turned her attention to the garden. She started digging some flower beds, but as she was working, she came across some small bones in the dirt, baby-sized bones. This house used to belong to a doctor. The lady puts two and two together and assumes he was doing something shady, or maybe he did some off-the-books abortions back in the day. This lady is shocked and terrified that her new home could be tainted by this horrible past, but she didn't call the police. Instead, she just avoids the garden completely. The whole thing weighs heavily on her mind as the years go by, 5, 10, 15 years. I forget how long exactly, but it was at least a decade, until one day she can't take it anymore and calls the police to report the bones. My dad goes out to investigate into the garden where she shows him roughly where they were. He digs around a little. This was the 80s and apparently they were less concerned with disturbing evidence and finds not a dead baby, but a small plastic skeleton. Poor woman had been living with guilt and fear for decades because of a kid's toy. Well, that's a lot to live with. Also, she didn't do anything to report it, which is also, not that great for her. Not everybody has skeletons in the closet. Sometimes they're in the garden. And then they're fake, so you really don't have anything to worry about anyway. Story 8. My uncle is a cop and likes to tell us about how in the 90s in Philly there was an area so poor and ghetto most cops just avoided it unless there was a call. Well, that's where he lived because rent was cheap, and he was a 6'3", 240 former minor league linebacker. Yes, it's a thing. Here, I've Googled it for you since the guys apparently can't figure that out. He was driving through one day and saw something in a trash can that caught his eye. He drove back around. One-way roads, and there was someone behind him. He pulled up and looked for a few seconds, readjusted his glasses, looked, got out, and walked to the can. Sure enough, he really was looking at a human foot sticking right up and out. He called it in. Cops were all over in just a few minutes. That's when some fat white woman and her very, very thick accented Hispanic boyfriend came out, both shirtless, her in a bra. The guy screamed something that sounded like gibberish to my uncle, but he believed to be, "Hey, now you get away from there." That's when the 350-pounder, 5'4" wildebeest came out charging the officer, crying to show some respect. Well, you run at cops, you get a pair of bracelets and a timeout. So while she was in timeout, they were able to get out of her that her kids were at school. Her mother was supposed to watch them. Her mother was an addict. Her mother OD'd, and her mother is now in the trash can. Story 9. Pretty common where I work. No one calls the police. Probably the most extreme was a shots fired call, extremely common, on a certain street that we really don't go down without backup. We drive through and don't see anything. Then maybe 10 minutes later, we get an anonymous call about a shootout inside a vacant house. We find the door wide open, covered in blood. We make entry and find an absolute bloodbath. Blood, drugs, and casings everywhere. We recover an AK pistol that had been fired. There was evidence people had been dragged out. We only got the one call about it, and no one showed up at a hospital later. Shot. Story 10. Another one, I was responding to a disturbance call in a trailer park that turned out to be BS. As I was leaving, I noticed a giant puddle of blood on the ground near a different trailer. Upon further inspection, I realized that there was blood all over one of the doors, complete with smeared handprints and blood dripping off the doorknob. It looked like a freaking massacre. I started pounding on the door, and this junkie comes out and starts yelling at me for waking her up. I asked her if she was hurt, and she said she wasn't. She then proceeds to go ape on me about all the blood. She has no idea where it came from. I followed the ungodly amount of blood to a trailer about a block down where there is this giant party taking place. I ask the group of guys standing outside where the injured person is, and they all go G-code on me and say they don't know what I'm talking about, while standing in the blood trail. I push past and continue down the road to Oz, where at the end of it I find a guy in what used to be an all-white outfit that is now dark red, attempting to control his massive head bleed on his own. I later discovered that he had been trying to break into that other trailer when he drunkenly cut his head on the window that he broke. Wow, what a wild ride. Hey, does anybody know where all this blood is? I'll never tell. Poor guy, hope he's doing okay. Wait, he's the problem, isn't he? Well, you know what? I hope everyone's fine regardless. Story 11. Not a cop, I'm a paramedic. But I think this fits. My partner and I were at our post, which was in the parking lot of a strip mall that had a bunch of stores and one bar which was known to be pretty sketchy. My partner was taking a little nap. It was around 1 a.m., and I was watching a movie on my phone waiting for a call. Eventually, I notice a few people coming out of the bar and just sort of lingering in the parking lot. A few more people come out. One lights up a cigarette and they all just stand around. I go back to my movie, and 20 minutes later, I notice there is now a much larger group lingering outside of the bar. Nothing strange was happening, but I thought it was weird that they'd all have been there for so long, so I decided to check it out. I woke up my upset partner to have him pull our rig closer to the group. As we approach with our lights on, the group notices us and starts to break apart. A few people scatter, and I see that in the middle of the group there is a person on the ground, motionless. My partner and I jump out and ask what's going on. Somebody in the group goes, "This guy's wasted, he just stumbled out here and fell asleep on the ground." I shout to the man on the ground and he doesn't respond. I check for a pulse and there is none. I start CPR, while my partner gets our jump bag and notifies dispatch. For a full 30 minutes, people had just stood around and looking at this dead guy on the ground. Some smoking cigarettes, none doing anything about it. There wasn't even a noticeable commotion. Nobody asked if he needed help or called anybody, and they probably never would have. The guy was cool to touch by the time we got to him. Down for at least 30 minutes. We went through the motions, but there was no saving him. We transported, and he was pronounced at the hospital within 15 minutes. How freaking hard is it to ask someone if they are okay, or to dial 911? How is not one single person in that group not alarmed by seeing a man sleeping on the ground in a parking lot? I've had similar variations of this scene happen at least 3 times while on duty. People just don't care. Story 13. My first year on the job, I was patrolling in a frat house neighborhood near a big Midwestern college. It was a Friday night on a football weekend, so we had our eyes peeled for any gatherings that looked potentially chaotic. Sure enough, we pulled onto one smaller block with a narrow street, where there were no less than 5 simultaneous keg stands happening right in the middle of the road. Several neighbors were looking out their windows with angry looks, but clearly none of them cared enough to get any of us on the horn. Good thing we stopped by, because several dumb kids were passed out and needed medical attention immediately. But wait, it gets better. Of the several intoxication arrests I made that night, one of them happened to be the daughter of one of my dad's best buddies. They had been roommates at that exact same college years before. That arrest, which wasn't her first one, caused her to get expelled from the college, and word somehow got back to my dad that I was the cop who randomly stopped by and made the arrest. When I went to my parents' house for dinner the following week, my dad greeted me by beating me senseless with a pair of jumper cables. That's kind of shocking, but, the guy was just doing his job. It's crazy that his dad, for some reason, the loyalty to his friend's daughter is more to his son. Get out of here. Story 14. Not a cop, I was the guy they walked up on. And I wasn't doing anything illegal or worthy of calling the cops, but I guess it was just questionable enough to take a quick detour. So I'll start by saying I used to live in California, and Fresno was one of the places I lived at. This had to be back in '06 or so. At the apartments I lived at, I never really had many issues, but I guess further in at the back of the complex in those buildings, some shady stuff was going down. At least once a month, the police copter was hovering over this place, spotlighting the area, and I never really knew why until much later. I moved into a unit in their sister complex in '08 and got to talking with head maintenance worker in charge of both places and got the beans spilled. Crazy meth head guy doing weird psycho stuff like selling the washer/dryer units provided in the apartment for money, straight crashing through his sliding glass door. Weird stuff with him and the people he had there. Place was large enough and I was clear on the other side of it. I had no freaking idea, but I guess some of the antics going on back there were SWAT team worthy. So the last of those Star Wars prequels had come out on DVDs still somewhat recently, and for some reason one of my buddies thought it would be cool and fun to choreograph lightsaber fights, just because we were silly nerds in our early 20s. Figured if we got some moves down, we'd spend some cash on some good prop lightsabers to spar with. But we basically used broken sticks he ordered up. Actually, come to think of it, our first version was a couple dowels and a small 5-inch long or so pipe at the bottom for the handle and counterweight. But those guys broke in quick and he found the broken sticks online that were more durable and meant to hit each other for sparring and hold up. So usually we'd end up doing this crap. Just messing about, hitting each other with these gosh dang sticks like idiots and choreographing up these moves we'd follow. We happened to be doing this on police helicopter night finally, and they spot us freaking about with these sticks. Spotlight lands on us. We stop, look up, give a little wave. Spotlight doesn't move. I look at my buddy, he looks at me. I shrug. Screw it, we're not doing anything illegal. We go back into it. A minute later, here comes about 4 to 5 officers all in tactical gear with assault rifles. They were holding them pretty casually, but I guess they got sent to see if we were just messing about or if they happened to come across a fight during their call. They asked us what we were doing, and saying we were practicing lightsaber moves sounded pretty freaking dumb. So we told them we were practicing for a play. Pretty much dropped it at that. They asked me where a building number was and told us we should probably go inside for the night. And off they went. Story 15. This was only a few years back. Driving along a suburban road one night, and a guy wearing only his underwear ran up to our cop car and threw a very large sofa cushion at us. As we slowed down to find out why he had thrown said cushion, he tried to jump into the back of the car. We got out and had a chat with the poor guy, who told us he had used about an 8-ball of poor quality drugs and wanted to get our attention to help him. Kicker was, he'd been running around the suburban streets all drugged up for about 30 minutes and no one thought it was odd enough to call us. To be fair, it wasn't the nicest area. Man, hope he's doing alright. To be fair, I live in a similar area. Sounds like Tuesday. Story 16. Not a cop, but this is my uncle's story from the early 90s in Chicago. Elderly couple calls in what they said sounded like a gunshot from the apartment below them. My uncle and his partner arrive on the scene and enter the apartment. Weapons drawn. Standard protocol for a possible shooting in progress. Right in the entryway is what's left of a middle-aged Italian gentleman who apparently made the decision to end his life by shooting himself in the head with a .45 Right in the entryway is what's left of a middle-aged Italian gentleman who apparently made the decision to end his life by shooting himself in the head with a .45 revolver. He's obviously dead. According to my uncle, his face was basically blown in half. Nose missing, one eye gone, and the other hanging from what's left of the socket. My uncle's partner goes out to the squad car to radio for the cleanup crew, the guys that come and scoop up the dead guy. My uncle stands at the door making sure no one enters the apartment until they arrive. About 5 minutes pass and my uncle hears what sounds like something moving inside the apartment. He figures the guy probably has a cat or a dog. Your pet will eat you if you die, and they are hungry, by the way. So he heads back in to shoo it away so it doesn't further damage the guy's body. He opens the door, and the guy with his face blown in half is standing there. My uncle reached for his sidearm and nearly shot the guy thinking he was a zombie or something. The guy just collapses again. Not like fall into a slump sort of collapsed, like falls straight back, hits his head with a thud sort of collapsed. My uncle, after regaining his composure, radios his partner to call for EMS and then proceeds to check the guy's pulse. Nothing. When EMS arrived, they said there was no way the guy should have survived the initial shot and that they would have assumed he was dead too based on the amount of damage. My uncle says in his entire 20-year career, which included several shootouts and car chases, that he never felt more scared than when he opened the door and saw that guy, who by all rights should have been dead, standing there. Story 17. We'll leave out some details, but here it goes. Went out on a Friday to check on a couple of houses where we know a lot of dope goes in and out. Rolled by the house in my unmarked, 4 to 5 subjects outside, under a carport, all is well. Second unmarked says they're 5 seconds out, so we pull in. Get out my unit, and first thing you can smell is burnt weed and mojo. Deal with the ones outside, then turn attention to the people inside. First thing I see is a baby in a car seat without a care in the world looking around and smiling. Second is the female passed out on the recliner 5 feet from the baby after she smoked some synthetic marijuana. After subjects start to exit the house and everything is going smoothly, all kinds of dope laid out everywhere. No big deal. Little background on me here. I've got 3 girls, one is almost 2, one will be 5 in 2 weeks, and one will be 13 in May. Those little girls are my everything. After homeowner gives us permission to go inside, right inside a big backpack about a foot from the baby in the car seat is a pound of weed, about a quarter pound of meth, several different pills, and other miscellaneous dope. If it was just an empty backpack full of drugs, that's a daily thing in my line of work. But no, these sick turds, not the word I really used when I saw it, had the baby's teething toys, pacifiers, formula, and even bottles in the same freaking bag as their dope. I don't mean in separate compartments or anything, I mean all in the bag compartment of your normal backpack. I've seen some crap in my time in law enforcement. Nothing gets to me like mistreated babies, kids, elderly people, etc. At that point, I wish I could have taken that sweet little girl and just hugged her. Only a few things hit harder than that of the little kids being brought up in that world. Was a rough rest of the day for me that day. Story 18. I remember not long after I started, 9 years ago, a woman came to the police department saying she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in 3 days. She told me where he lived, and once I got there was no answer. I was able to gain entry and noticed the ripe smell of death. There was tweaker crap everywhere, stuff taken apart, random tools and motors, and all kinds of stuff tweakers work on. The house was near pitch black due to all the foil and blankets covering the windows. As I began to clear the house, I walked into one of the kitchen entries, and as I turned to the corner, I looked into a big wall mirror and saw the reflection of her boyfriend hanging from a doorway. His body was a death gray, and his neck had stretched at least 8 inches. I remember having to pick him up and pull the belt from the doorway. The image has stayed with me every day since. Wow. I mean, he had just started the job, and then this is one of the first things you do. I mean, this poor girl just lost her boyfriend. This poor guy lost his life. And then the OP, what a horrific scene. I don't even know how you ever, I don't know what kind of counseling or therapy or whatever you can do to deal with the trauma of a horrific experience like that, but goodness gracious. Story 19. There was a quadruple murder in a residential area here in Sweden back in 1980 with several witnesses that heard and saw the incident. The attacker shot a girl by accident and then shot another guy in the following moments. The killer shot a total of 12 shots over the course of several hours. Stabbed 2 others with a kitchen knife. He finished everything off by dragging the girl outside because he felt guilty, hoping that someone would find her and call paramedics, but realized whilst dragging her that she was dead and nothing could be done. so he threw her down an elevator shaft. The whole ordeal lasted for 4 hours and no one called the cops, even though 12 shots were fired and screams were heard. The killer was arrested 2 days later and was killed 18 years later by the son of the first guy that was killed. I have the Swedish police report if anyone is interested in reading it. Story 20. I hate people who do this, but screw it. I'm going to be one of those people. Not a police officer, and this is also not as crimey as most on here, but about 3 years ago, me and a friend took a road trip to visit another friend who was studying at a different university 5 hours away from us. It was our first solo trip without a real adult. Part of the motorway we had to drive on to get there is up in the mountains. It's very, very isolated in terms of there being no houses or anything. It's just a 3-hour stretch of road with nothing around it. It's very straight and you can see quite far ahead of you thanks to the way the road is. I don't know how to properly explain it. Anyway, despite the whole in the mountains thing, it was a super busy road. It's the main motorway people drive on to get in and out of my area. That means a lot of lorries and tankers and loggers on it as well as regular travelers. So we're about a half hour onto this stretch of road. Middle of the day, it's pretty packed as usual. On the opposite side, there's a tanker on fire on the hard shoulder. The whole cab was completely engulfed in flames. Really crazy big flames with huge plumes of smoke billowing off, and the entire body of the tanker is plastered in hazard symbols. There's a car flipped in front of it also on fire, but it's over the divide and in the field. So we're like, holy crap, what do we do? Our 18-year-old brains are just like, where is the adult to tell us what to do? We slow down a little as we pass to try and make it out if the drivers are still in there, but can't tell because the flames and smoke make it so hard to really see. So as we pass, since I'm the passenger, I dial 999, because who wouldn't freaking dial 999 when they pass a flipped burning car and a tanker that's possibly about to freaking explode? And the convo basically went like, hey, can I get police and fire services? Thank you. Well, there's this giant tanker on insert road name between insert junction numbers on the north side and the cab is really on fire. Looks like it has been for a while and the whole body of the tank is covered in hazard symbols and we couldn't tell if the driver is stuck in there or not, and there's a car flipped in the field that's on fire too. And I'm so sorry because I know you probably received hundreds of calls about it already, but there's no one there and we can't see any blue lights on the road ahead. And you know what the lovely operator says? Well, ma'am, it looks like you're the first person to call. Insert other standard crap like taking my contact info and asking some follow-up questions. Thank you for letting us know. We have dispatched emergency services. They are on their way. How could all those hundreds of other travelers who use that road have driven past it and not even considered calling? It's still something that I think about here and there. What if my car flipped one day and I was potentially stuck inside it while I burned and no one bothered calling and just casually drove past? The whole road got closed for a few days because I guess whatever was in the tank leaked out and the road itself was pretty melted too. I never did see or hear anything about the drivers, so I hope people involved got out and were okay. Yeah, it's always a very weird situation where people just sit in their own circumstances and their own situations and be like, well, that's crazy to see. Now I'm going to keep on my way to Wendy's, you know? And to be fair, there are some people who just assume that other people are going to call and that someone else is going to be on it. So they're like, well, I hope he's okay. Bye-bye. And, you know, it's very scary and you never know if someone's going to call or not. So good on these guys for, you know, they said they needed an adult around, but sounds like they figured out exactly what to do. Story 21. Obligatory, not a cop, but I am an EMT. We were waiting at a light right as we were headed back to the station for our end of shift. We see a man running like Usain Bolt across the crosswalk to beat a light and the woman chasing him. My partner and I look at each other and he says, she's gonna get hit. Sure as crap, the car in the rightmost lane guns it as the light turns green and the next thing we see is flip-flops flying and a pair of legs in the air. Female was plowed over and landed on her face in the street. We immediately turn on our lights and hop out of the ambulance. When we get to the girl, she's unconscious, peed herself, and is bleeding from multiple lacerations on her limbs and a nasty head wound. My partner, who is a paramedic, starts his assessment as I go grab a backboard and a C-collar and call into dispatch. She wakes up and immediately starts screaming about her boyfriend leaving her. She stands up and tries to run after him, face plants on the curb and proceeds to lose a tooth. We finally calmed her down enough to get her onto the gurney. Mind you, she wouldn't listen and kept trying to walk around after suffering a couple head injuries. Once we get her into the back of the ambulance and out of the road into a nearby parking lot, the driver that hit her rolls up, By now, firefighters are on the scene and asking what the heck is going on. We give them the lowdown and my partner tells them that we can handle it, so they leave, confused and somewhat trepidatious. We talk to this woman for a while insisting that she needs to go to the hospital, but she keeps saying that she can't go and she needs to find her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the driver who hit her is apologizing to me and saying she wants to help any way she can. The woman keeps saying she can't go to the hospital. After we got her cleaned up and bandaged all the wounds, she asks if we can take her to her boyfriend's house. Well, as an EMT, I can do one of two things, either take you to the hospital or leave you where you are. She refuses transport vehemently, so my partner and I tell her that we can't take her anywhere. She then proceeds to hop out of the ambulance and ask the driver who just hit her if she would take her to her boyfriend's house if she didn't call the cops. Sure as heck, before we can ever radio in that patient was refusing transport to the hospital, she's rolling away in the car that just hit her and tossed her 8 feet in the air. It's not the craziest story, but one of the few that just happened to be up there. Story 22. Police officer in a very wealthy rural area. People out walking at night is not typically normal. We usually stop, say hi, and ask if they need anything, then go on our way. One rainy night, I was driving down one of our busier roads, still in the middle of nowhere, and saw a teenage male just running. He was clearly not exercising, so I stopped and asked him if he was okay. I asked if he wanted a ride somewhere so he could get out of the rain. He said he had gotten into a fight with his parents and was running to his friend's house. He was acting strange and it seemed that he was hiding something. I decided it was best to just take him where he was going and hopefully speak with an adult who could explain further. He said that was fine and that his parents' friends could explain, so he hops in and we go. Sure enough, I pull into the driveway and look up into the window. I see a group of teenagers, one girl in a brawl. They see my police car and give me the "oh crap" look, shut the blinds and start scattering everywhere. I realized this was an underage party and said to the kid, "Dude, why did you just have me drive you here?" He then realized what he had just done and he turned very red. Turns out his argument with his parents was because they didn't want him going to this party and he just ran out of the house. He could have told me to take him home, to Wendy's, anywhere but there, and I would have gladly done it. Why did the kid even agree to that? To the stipulation of like, yeah, you can talk to the friend's parents, they'll explain everything. There were no parents. What was this guy on? I guess, when the cop pulls up, you're under pressure, you're not thinking right. But still, during that drive, I'd be like, geez, I'm making audible. Can we go somewhere else, please? I don't know. Maybe he was hoping the cop would just join the party or something? Story 23. I pulled a car over in a low-income, high-crime area after seeing a 2-year-old standing on the front seat. I noticed a sizable crowd outside near where the car stopped, but that's not uncommon for the area. Talked to the driver and the other adult passenger and realized they aren't wearing seatbelts either. I politely let them know that they're grown adults and while the law says that they have to wear their seatbelts, they're grown adults and I'm willing to let that slide. But they will be receiving a ticket for not restraining the child. I was sitting in my patrol unit, sitting there writing the ticket when I see someone approaching me. I roll the window down expecting to get an earful about why are we always harassing people. Instead, the young lady screams at me, "Are you going to do something about that?" and points at the large tree a half a block away. I look at her, summon every ounce of restraint I have and calmly ask, "The tree?" "No, behind it." 1, 2, 3, deep breath. "Ma'am, I can't see through the tree." "What's the problem?" "He's choking her." I get out of the car and start approaching the tree, telling the driver of the car I stopped to stay there or I'll get a warrant for his arrest on the traffic charge and resisting. As I approach the tree, I swing out wide and see, sure as heck, there's a dude choking the absolute crap out of another chick. I call for additional officers, draw my weapon, and order the guy to let her go. He does, and she runs off. Dude starts calmly walking away. I tell him to stop. He doesn't, so I holster my weapon, grab him, do an armbar takedown, and put him in cuffs. I radio headquarters and tell them I've got one in custody. As I'm walking him back to my unit, he suddenly twists around and tries to bite me in the face. Now I'm a big guy, 6'4", and having someone try to jump at you and try to bite your face will result in an immediate reaction. Mine was twofold. I leaned back and to the side and I also pushed his head straight down as hard and fast as I could. Because he was lunging at me through the air, this resulted in a spectacular unplanned hip toss wherein I flipped the gentleman/possible zombie onto his back in the middle of the street in front of a large crowd in a neighborhood that isn't very friendly to police. The moment he was headed over heels in the air is also a moment my backup unit turned the corner. He saw what was happening and called for more backup. So, Mr. Zombie starts kicking at me, and I repeatedly tell him to stop resisting as I grab his arm, get him to his feet, and put him in the back of the unit. Now, I approach the crowd to ask if anyone knows where the victim ran off to, and I'm expecting hostility because A, it's a hostile neighborhood, and B, while I was defending myself from an attack, I don't expect them to care about me and my safety nearly so much as the fact that I just tossed their neighbor on the ground while he was in handcuffs. I was surprised. The first person to speak up was an older woman whose house I've been to multiple times to arrest her son. That was a good thing, because that meant she knew me and people know me. Even people who know me from an adversarial standpoint tend to like me and trust me because I'm always fair with everyone I deal with. She said loudly, "Baby, I don't know why he didn't listen to you and avoid all that foolishness." I was able to actually watch the hostility drain from the faces of many in the crowd. I commented on how unnecessary the whole thing was and asked if anyone knew where the victim went. I immediately got a volunteer to go get her. When the victim got there, I see that, in addition to bruises on her neck from the strangulation, she's got a black eye and a brush burn on her forehead. I found out that her boyfriend, the biter, had been dragging her around the neighborhood and beating her like a dirty rug. I was going to say rented mule, but you really shouldn't beat mules. For a good 15 minutes before I made my traffic stop. The crowd that was there when I pulled the car over? Easily 20 people, and they all watched him drag her behind the tree and strangle her as she tried to call for help. No one helped her, no one called the cops, and the one who notified me waited a good 5 minutes to do so. The driver of the car I pulled over got out and asked me if he could go. I said no. He said I had bigger fish to fry. I told him he could say that when he's seen a toddler go through a windshield. Buckle up your kids. Story 24. I have a friend that passed his 10th year mark yesterday, which is I guess halfway to whatever pension adjustment / pay increase comes at a 20-year mark. Anyways, we had some beers for this mark and I asked him this question. He said firstly that it was his 2nd year on the job and he was pretty comfortable with his current role, all the rookie mistakes long gone. I'll just say that this is in a downtown area in one of the 3 biggest cities in America at the time. He comes out of an Italian restaurant after a night shift meal and heads down a small alley, length of the restaurant, to get to his patrol car and hears whimpering. He hears, "Oh crap, I'm releasing," distinguishable by the tone of voice that a man is definitely about to nut, not someone running late. About halfway down the alley, he slows down and starts muffling his steps. Then he hears, "Oh, I'm releasing too." He's 99% sure it's a different voice. As he turns the corner, he sees one male hobo having relations with another male hobo who is having relations with a medium-sized dog. Cringes. Both of them climaxing together and the dog. All facing my friend about 10 feet away from the edge of the corner. Pretty sure he got PTSD from all 3 of them staring at him. 2 of which mid-nut. Haunting stuff. Dear God. Story 25. Of course I'm not a cop. I was driving home from work after a long day of severe thunderstorms pounding Kansas City. I was on the highway. Lots of traffic in front of me, hardly anyone behind me. Everyone was moving to the right lane, and I quickly saw 2 smashed cars on the shoulder and car parts all over the slow lane. Not a soul even slowed down. It wasn't the best part of city, but nowhere close to the worst part. I pulled over and checked the car in front. It was empty. I checked the second, and the driver was drunk but otherwise uninjured. He said he crashed 10 minutes prior and I was the first to stop, but please don't call the cops. I wasn't interested in his request and called anyway. After I said the driver reported he had no injuries but appeared and smelled intoxicated, the 911 dispatcher put me on hold. She came back on, said all first responders were busy with flood rescues and they'd dispatch police in a tow when they could, and I would stay at the scene. After about 25 minutes sitting there, the driver walked over and asked if I'd drive him home. I said he'd get a leaving the scene. He just said, "Man, if they arrest me for leaving the scene sometime tomorrow, they won't arrest me for DUI. They got my car and my plate. They'll know where to find me." Screw it. Dude got a ride. I went home. Cops never called back for a follow-up. Hey, sounds like both people win. Kind of. Well, this guy was drunk driving and crashed his car, and he really probably should have been punished so that he wouldn't do it again. But you know what? This guy was just trying to do the right thing, and they're like, "Hey, stay there and wait until we get someone out there." He's like, "I just want to go home." So, I mean, it kind of works out for everybody. I guess you could still report him. We'll never know. Story 26. I was on my way home at the end of a shift when I saw a low priority call pop up in my car computer for a woman who called because there was a strange car parked in front of her house. It was about 1 a.m. I decide to swing by and clear it out. When I get there, the car is actually in her yard, has been crashed into a tree, and all the doors and trunk are open. Nobody is around. I run the tag and I'm standing in the street when I hear a voice say, "Excuse me, sir, can you help me?" And a guy walks out of the shadows from between two houses across the street and collapses at my feet. Checked him and found he had been shot about an inch above the base of his scrotum. He was still conscious but wouldn't provide any information about who shot him or what was going on. It remained a mystery for the next 20 minutes or so until another unit in the area stopped a guy walking down the street carrying a carburetor. He claimed he was just waiting for a ride, but he had the same last name as the registered owner of the car, so he was detained. After wading through a long story full of BS and tracking down some of the other involved parties, we got a rough idea of what happened. Apparently, the crashed car was being driven by Carburetor Guy, who was a local gang member who was hot-rodding through a neighborhood run by a different gang. That gang piled into a car and a chase ensued, eventually causing Carburetor Guy to crash into the complaint's front yard. Carburetor and his buddies flee on foot. However, he remembers a particularly valuable carburetor is in the trunk, so he returns and retrieves it. But by this time, the other gang is there and they produce several firearms and rob him of his sunglasses. He gives them over but keeps the carb. When one of the other gangs starts shooting, he is also armed and returns fire, managing to hit his assailant, who is by now at the hospital getting a large amount of blood drained out of his punctured bladder. Story 27. I'm not a police officer, but a few years back I was out in Los Angeles with a few friends. We had just left a club on Hollywood Boulevard, Level 7, Club 7. I can't remember the name. And we were checking out the Walk of Fame before turning in for the night. It was around 3 a.m. when we hit a corner and knew something was up when we noticed a large crowd gathered around the street light pole. As we approached, we saw a guy sitting down on the ground, leaning against the pole while holding his stomach. My buddy and I got closer and saw the guy had blood all over his shirt and his eyes were shut. Turns out the guy was stabbed several times by a group of guys in a minivan. To add insult to injury, the guys who stabbed him were doing circles around the block and taunting him as they passed. It was painfully obvious to me that no one had called the cops because every time someone tried, he would say, "Don't snitch." My buddy and I were in the Marines at the time and doing our best to stay out of sketchy crap, so we called 911, reported the stabbing, and got the heck out of there. Frickin' LA, man. Story 28. My friends and I were driving to Dunkin' Donuts during our lunch period in the Bronx. About 2 blocks away from school, we see a white sedan and an SUV next to each other, one of them blocking the road and facing the wrong way. I stop and wait because I don't have anywhere to go. Sedan in the wrong lane speeds up, swerves out of the way of my car and parks it up in a spot next to me on the other side of the street. SUV starts coming down the lane and a guy gets out of the sedan with a baseball bat and one-handed swings that crap right into the speeding SUV's windshield, cracking the entire passenger side. SUV continues driving off and the guy gets back in his sedan and chases him down. My friend and I are in total shock and just go straight back to school, skipping the coffee and bagels. We go straight to our guidance counselor and tell him what happened, and he just looks at us like, "Well, did you call the cops?" Not for a second did it cross our minds to even look at the license plates. Yeah, I wish I could say that I would be the person to think about that at the time, but if I'm seeing a scene go down, I don't know again who's called the cops, what the situation is, but I'm just really focusing on getting out of the situation. So I can't really blame them completely, but I don't know. I think I have to go put myself in the situation and then I can really figure out whether or not I'm composed under pressure. It remains to be seen. Story 29. Oh, the things I could post. I'm an ex-paramedic and used to work for our medical examiner's office. I apologize for not being police specifically. After reading these posts, one particular instance comes to mind. While working for the MEO, we were called for a badly decomposed decedent. She was in the bathroom of a housing facility. Her remains had leaked into the air ducting and flooring. EMS had been called because someone had slipped and fallen on her liquefaction in the hallway. I realized that a lot of these folks probably had bad run-ins with the police, but to let someone rot like that astounded me. You could smell it from outside the facility, and it took someone injuring themselves to have the authorities called. There was still a pic of me in a ghost suit on our local wall of shame because I ended up in the bathtub after almost adding myself to the injured while slipping across the bathroom. Story 30. Not a cop. Back in my community college days, I went to a Taco Bell across the street in the late morning to review some assignments about an hour before class. I I was the only customer in during that time, just focused on my work. About 15 minutes later, two huge guys with guns come in to rob the place dressed very much like what you would consider a street thug. I honestly didn't even notice until the lookout started asking me questions about my papers and to stay put. The workers complied, but the safe was on a timer, so we were all stuck in that Taco Bell for about half an hour. During that time, it was getting close to noon and several customers tried to come in, but the lockout, who was a large man, obviously dressed like a gangster with jewelry and saggy clothes, turned away at least a dozen customers saying that the Taco Bell was closed right before noon. A lot of them were extremely upset that they couldn't have their tacos, but didn't think twice that there was something suspicious about a huge dude in street clothes turning them away. Some terrified random kid sitting inside with no staff in uniform in sight, with all the doors unlocked. They ended up getting away with whatever money they took. They didn't rob me, thankfully. No one was hurt. I missed class and had to give a statement to some detectives. But hey, I got a free soda out of the whole thing, so yay. The least they could have offered the guys a crunch wrap or something. Goodness. That would also be, like, just so terrifying. What do? Make conversation with these guys? Half an hour? Goodness gracious. Hope the Baja Blast was worth it. Story 31. I have two. I used to work in a small town, but for the county sheriff's department. I was coming into town and I saw a car belonging to a guy we'll call Jimmy, awkwardly parked on the side of the road. Lights on and the car was running. It was about 1:30 a.m. on a Wednesday, so this was out of the ordinary. I pulled over and approached the car. I could see Jimmy's kids playing in the back seat, and I saw Jimmy asleep with an uncovered syringe on the front seat. He was unresponsive, and the kids confirmed he used the needle and passed out. This wouldn't be my first drug experience with Jimmy. I called medics and gave him a dose of Narcan. He came out of it as EMS arrived. Second story, same small town. About 4 a.m., it's dead outside, and I parked to get out for a cigarette. I've since quit. Halfway through, I heard a very loud fart from an empty desert behind me. I turn my flashlight towards the sound and see Carl, a known drunkard, stuck and passed out in a chala. For those who don't know, a chala is a cactus that absolutely sucks to get stuck to you. Another deputy and I pulled him out. From his screams, it seemed painful. He was transported to the hospital by EMS. He almost died from all the exposure and infections from his wounds. 2 months later, I found him dead in the same spot. Story 32. One Friday night at about 0100, I was patrolling the streets when I noticed some headlights down a cross street that didn't look quite right. I continued around the block and came up behind the car and could now see that it appeared to be parked on the wrong side of the road. Well, as I got close, it became obvious that it had crashed into the side of a parked semi-trailer. Now, I could not see the front, so I called it out to dispatch as a property damage accident only, rather than a personal injury accident, and that I would advise for further. As I was walking up to it, I rounded the front so that I could assess the scene. Well, when I got the full picture, I realized that the little car had slipped under the trailer and the top had been peeled back like a sardine tin all the way to the back seat. The trailer was laying on top of the passenger compartment because the car kicked the trailer support legs up. Now at this point there was too much intrusion on the vehicle for me to see any body parts, but I am 100% certain that this is going to be a decapitation fatal. Maybe it was wishful thinking, maybe just routine, but I called out, "Police, hello!" And to my surprise, I hear a dude start yelling for help. Long story short, this guy was drunk and blacked out while driving. I guess it was not his time to go because his backseat reclined back on impact and he slid under the trailer, only catching his nose on the edge of it. 1 mile an hour faster and he would have crushed his skull. Walked away with a broken nose. After investigating the incident and checking security cameras, I found out that this dude crashed an hour prior to me finding him on a heavily traveled section of roadway. Not one call. Story 33. I might be too late to the thread, but here it goes. I drove up to an apartment where the fire alarm was going off and there were visible flames from what looked like the kitchen window of one apartment. This was a 16-unit apartment with approximately 40 people living in it. There were no emergency personnel on the scene. I asked who had called the fire department and no one answered. I asked again. Someone said, "Isn't that what the alarm means?" I understand that some building fire alarms automatically alert the fire department, but this was not one. Nor should anyone assume emergency vehicles are on the way just because the alarm is going off. People had been watching the fire for at least 5 minutes and complaining about the fire department not being there. The station was 1 mile away. I called the fire department and they were there in 3 minutes. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these stories just kind of come down to people assuming that it was probably already done. And, ignorance, I guess. When you don't know, you don't know. And sometimes a lot of people can suffer more because of it. So, you know what? Next time you see something, say something. Even if you think they've already been reported and called about thousands of times. What's one more? Story 34. Cop in a pretty big city. About 10 p.m. and an NFL game had just ended. Traffic was a nightmare. As I'm approaching a major intersection, I notice that lanes aren't moving together, which is odd because all traffic was moving in the direction of the interstate. Thought maybe it was an accident and the moron stopped in the lane. Can't see though, so I figured someone would call it if it was an emergency. Finally pull up to the intersection to find an old lady in yellow rain boots and a pink fuzzy hat directing traffic and screaming at cars as they passed. Nobody called it in. Story 35. Not a cop, but let me quickly share an absurd situation that I happened upon and realized no one called the cops. B22. Have roommates in apartment. Go out running at night with 2 roommates. Be walking back, winded, around 1 a.m. Neighborhood high school on our left across the street, 9 to 12. See an LAPD patrol car drive up from oncoming. They don't see us in the dark. Watch patrol car drive up to the curb by the school. Passenger tosses something out. Patrol car hits U-turn and squeals away fast as can be. Curious. Walks up to the curb. See handgun. Go what the heck and look around. No one seems to be looking. Pick up handgun with shirt and run to apartment 4 houses down. See it's loaded. Unload bullets. Throw gun and bullets 2 different garbage bins down the street. Needless to say, we never called the cops. Story 36. 911 dispatcher. I got off work one day and on my drive home came across an accident where one woman had been ejected from the car. There were 10 people who had either pulled over or come out of their homes to look, but no one approached her. I got out and went up to her. She was still conscious, so I didn't do CPR, just tried to keep her calm and not moving. I called 911 to give them an update and say something to the effect of, "Hey, I'm on the scene. This MVA on street name, and the lady is conscious and breathing," to which my coworker replied that they had no idea what I was talking about. None of these people called for probably 5 minutes of standing around looking at the accident. You know what's worse than 911 blowing up with dozens of people calling an accident? No one calling. Story 37. When I was younger, my parents and I and some of my parents' friends were at my brother's hockey game. While waiting in the lobby of the ice arena for the game to start, one of my parents' friends suddenly had a heart attack. Fortunately, my mother is a nurse and she instantly went into nurse mode, doing everything she could to ensure the safety of our family friend. He ended up okay, however, I don't know if anything horrible would have happened otherwise, or if my mom's presence actually benefited any. It sure is nice having a nurse for a mom. That has gotta be so comforting. I mean, there's multiple times where I get issues or I choke or, I just start to die a little bit. It's a long story, but, and no one's around. And then you start panicking and you luck your way into continue living, but do not underestimate the safety of a trained professional. Story 38. My dad was in the police, UK, for 30 years. And has told some crazy stories. Some of a spooky kind, some of a hilarious kind, and some tragic. One which struck me was a lady phoned the police claiming she killed her husband by accident. My dad and his partner show up and the guy is on the chair in the living room with cuts to his head. She explains she hit him with a glass ashtray after yet another domestic. My dad goes over to check vitals, notices he's breathing, and as he declares he's still alive, the guy sits up and goes, "I am, officer, and she's a crazy lady who should be arrested." Jumping out of his skin, the guy in the chair laughs it off and apologizes for inconvenience and said he wanted to make her feel guilty and that it was a joke that had gone too far. Man and wife make up, dad and partner leave. As they're going down the street, they hear screaming from the woman. My dad is not happy and turns back to find her crawling into the yard, throat slit, several stab wounds, and her husband armed with a bloody knife. Story 39. So there I am in my patrol car. I had just started my shift. This was the night after my baby boy was born, and gosh dang it was I a proud father. Right as I got in my cruiser that night, I taped a picture of my wife with him in her arms right on my dash so I could look at them. On with the story though. I turned down this road the local town liked to call Abandonedville. It was a single strip of road that happened to have a ton of old abandoned industrial buildings. I usually try and swing by since odd stuff is always happening in places like that. I get all the way to the end of the street where it starts to re-integrate with the rest of the city. That's when I see it. This huge man just beating away senselessly with like a length of chain link at this tiny little woman with a baby. Across the road, there was a diner with people just staring at this happen. No one called the police. At this point, my adrenaline's rushing, and with the recent emotional change in my own life, I just lose it, and I go into this tunnel vision mode. I jump out of my squad car, draw my sidearm, and start running at him. The times were different back then, being an officer in 1998, and when The Undertaker threw mankind off a Hell in a Cell and plummeted 16 feet through an announcer table. Story 40. Not a police officer, but my friend is. Situation. Live at the Jersey Shore, where there is a pizza place literally every 25 feet. You can stand in one place, and with just swiveling your head, you can visually see 3+ pizza places. So in town, there was this one place called, of course, Vinny's, a little hole in the wall for years and years. Then one day, the lot directly across the street has new construction on it, and as it turns out to be a new pizza place called Vinny's. Huh? The new place is bigger and has a sit-down section with menus as well as a few booths for people just grabbing a slice and soda, etc. One day, my friends get a call that there's a disturbance outside the pizza place. My friend rolls up and to his astonishment, sees 2 guys, one from each Vinny's, standing in the road arguing while whipping pizza dough at each other. My friend said he started to die laughing but had to compose himself before getting out of the car. I forget what happened after that, but I always felt that was pretty ludicrous. What I would have done to hear that conversation. 2 Italians arguing in the street? No, I'm a Vinny. No, I'm a Vinny. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to butcher you. I'm going to bust your face if you don't leave me a place to eat. Oh, they're the best. Story 41. My grandfather was a policeman for Cleveland, Ohio. He was very strict with my mother because she was the only girl and he didn't want her dating. He used to tell her horror stories from his work so my mother wouldn't date. This one always stuck with me. Apparently, it was about 2 a.m. when him and his partner got a call to a motel room on the bad side of town. It was a noise complaint, probably a domestic dispute. When he arrives at the motel, he finds a man walking around in the parking lot. As he approaches the man, he notices he looks distraught. He asks the man to spread his legs and his arms so he can see if he has a weapon. When my grandfather starts patting this guy down, he feels something strange in his chest pocket. When he takes out what he was feeling, to his disgust, he finds a slab of a woman's breast in the man's pocket. In short, a man and his girlfriend were fighting when the man started hacking her apart with a large knife and was saving parts of her to mess around with later. I'm not going to make the breast pocket joke. What I am going to say is that this is disgusting and sad and horrific. And as somebody who lives in Cleveland currently, I will say it's extra concerning. So, you know what? I'm not going to date around, especially not in the city. Story 42. Obligatory, not a cop, but this happened to me. I worked a Saturday shift and a colleague offered me a ride home. I said no, that I was okay to get a bus, but she insisted. We got in her car chatting. She drove about 20 meters down the road and started making a funny noise. I asked if she was okay, but she didn't really respond. She drove through a red light and around a corner, then pulled over, still making odd noises and not verbally responding. I got my door open and a woman came over and goes, "You just pulled through a red light. Oh my gosh." I said, "Yep, sorry," and this woman just stalked off. Totally ignored the situation and that I was clearly distressed and my friend was freaking dying. I had realized something was seriously wrong and called emergency services. I thought it was my colleague's heart, but turns out she was having a stroke in front of me. The entire time I was in the phone, waiting for an ambo. We were parked in front of a busy liquor store with people standing there watching, and not one came over, offered help, or called emergency services. It was abundantly clear that something was seriously wrong, and the only time anyone came over was when she was being loaded into the ambulance, and even then, it was only to stare. I followed the ambo in her car to the hospital and pulled a giant FU flip of the bird to the watchers as I did. Cue 5 hours waiting in the hospital with her until her family made it over from the other side of the country. She survived, but is never going to be the same. I now refuse to shop at that store. The owner was one of the rubberneckers. It gives me chills to think no one would have done anything if it was her or her own, and she likely would have died right there. Some people just don't seem to care, really, and it's sad, and they just kind of like, it's a spectacle, and they treat it like a movie or just a, what is this? This is crazy, and you know, it is part of staying in your own situation, your own circumstances. And to play devil's advocate, I'm sure some people are trying to think you don't intrude, you don't put yourself in other people's businesses. But also, it's gotten even worse now that if something like this happened, people still wouldn't do anything, but you know what? They'd record a nice TikTok of it. Story 43. About a year and a half ago, I had stopped a car that reeked of weed. Called for another unit to show up to search the car. It was a slow night, so another trooper and some of the local city officers showed up. Searched the car but didn't find anything. Cut the guy loose and started BSing with the other officers. As we were standing there, I happened to notice a guy walking down the sidewalk coming towards us. It was late at night, so I paid close attention to him. As he got close, he didn't see us because we were in a parking lot. I noticed that he was covered in blood. I called him over to us and realized that he had several head wounds and cuts to his arms. Asked him what happened, and he said his friends tricked him into walking into the woods and beat the crap out of him. I asked him why they would do that, and he said he didn't want to talk about it. I kept questioning him about the assault, but he didn't really come across as a victim. Guy just had a guilty vibe to him. I asked him to lift his shirt up to see if he had anything other than injuries, and on his back, I found several welts that looked like someone took a broom handle to him. It dawned on me that most likely a female beat the crap out of him with a broom, so I figured one way or another he stuck himself somewhere it didn't belong. I asked him again why someone would attack him, and he stated that they think I did something I didn't do. Biggest red flag in the world. I called the local county dispatch and asked if they had any recent SA/child molestation calls. Sure enough, a neighboring city was taking a molestation report, and the mother of a child stated she beat the suspect with a broom. Needless to say, Joker didn't have to worry about getting beat by his friends anymore. I'm sure the prisoners take care of that now. Story 44. Not a LEO, but I'm currently an emergency dispatcher. A couple days ago, we had a group of officers on a theft call, and a good amount of them were just area checking for the suspect. One of the units keys up and requests immediate cover to their location. We all come to find out that the officer was in a parking lot of nearby businesses and pretty much witnessed this guy stab a girl in the chest. They were able to detain the guy pretty immediately, and the girl was transported to a trauma hospital in a major city nearby, and as far as I know, she is still alive. There wasn't really any time for someone to call 911, but it was crazy that our officer just happened to be in the right place at the right time to see all this happen. Story 45. Not a cop, but a social worker. On a very busy street, someone was face down, passed out, surrounded by 8 to 10 adults taking pictures of him. I was in an area well known for ODs, and he OD'd on synthetic marijuana and was not doing good. I asked if anyone had called 911 yet, and sure enough, they had not. Another time on another street, 2 men were also heavily intoxicated on what I suspected synthetic marijuana. One person was leaning with their eyes pinned and no response to anything in and out of the street. His friend was up the street laying down in the middle of the road. 15 to 20 cars passed while I was trying to figure out what's going on and speak to the operator, and people walked past them and just took a picture and laughed. Very sad. Yeah, it is sad, and unfortunately, it feels like it's only getting worse. And there's always just this weird stigma with addicts and homeless or anyone that people view as lower than them, that they just become a spectacle, or it's almost like a zoo. Like they walk by it like, yeah, it's horrible. This guy's struggling to live. And they just go, well, this is crazy. Well, you dug your own grave, man. You shouldn't have done all that. So it's your problem now. I'm just going to move on and laugh about the experience. And it just sucks. Like you just lose a lot of humanity in people day by day. So I don't have any advice on how to change that. I'm just saying it's awful. Story 46. Not a cop, but about 4 years ago, I was on the Circle Road freeway around the city. Traffic is slow because of an accident in the median. As I pass a semi, I realize that the car behind it has its front end smashed in. I pulled over to a cop at the first accident and said there was a car accident back there. He said sarcastically, "Yeah, I know." To which I replied, "No, a second car accident behind a semi. A car hit the semi and the girl driving the car is still talking on her phone." To which he replied, "Dang it." Then he picked up his radio and called it in. I heard him saying, "Yes, another accident at the same location. Send another ambulance." Story 47. First reply, and I'm on mobile. So sorry. Working highway patrol in Australia, my partner and I were doing one last lap of our area before heading in to end the shift. We came across a 2-car collision with about 30 people standing around outside a patrol, gas, station. Decent damage, but no one looked injured. We pulled up and tried to figure out what had happened. We were very surprised we hadn't got a call about it yet. Car 1. We asked who was driving and 3 different guys sort of looked between them and all pointed at each other. After some digging, it turns out one of the 3 was the vehicle owner, the second was his brother, and the third his son. Turns out the driver was the son, who was a learner and didn't have a supervising licensed driver as required in Australia. Car 2. Guy walks up to us and said he was driving. Car was registered to his girlfriend, who was being suspiciously busy talking on her phone well away from wherever we were. I ran a check on the car and owner, and lo and behold, her license was suspended at the time for drunk driving. After a little prodding and disbelieving, girlfriend confessed to actually being the driver. So in this massive crowd of people who were mainly friends and family, no one had rung for police because both drivers shouldn't have been driving. Both drivers later had their day in court for their troubles. Well, crikey, there seems to be an accident over there. Well, should we call it? Should we say anything? Nah, just watch and we'll see what happens next. I'm just glad everyone's okay in the end. And you know what? All consequences came down, so good on you, Australia.